You might have heard the claim that religions do not have any evidence. This is not an entirely true statement. Any person who holds to a religious position has some sort of evidence for their position. The evidence might be a spiritual experience, a written record, or a miracle claim. What is most important to evaluate is whether the written record is historically reliable and whether there are any alternative explanations that can account for the data to a greater extent and is the least ad hoc. In this presentation, the central claims of Buddhism, Polytheism, Islam, Mormonism, and Christianity will be evaluated. The following criteria will be used to evaluate the religions. 1. Are there any alternative explanations that are within reason? 2. When was the written record written down? 3. Is it a conspiracy theory? Buddhism will now be evaluated. What is the central claim of Buddhism? The central claim is that reincarnation perpetually occurs, where the aim is to reach nihilistic oblivion called nirvana. What is the evidence for reincarnation? The cited evidence of reincarnation is Ian Stevenson's studies about children with memories of past lives, allegedly. There are severe methodological issues of Stevenson's studies, and Stevenson himself has admitted that all cases have severe flaws. Even if someone assumes that the data in Stevenson's study is valid for the sake of argument, there are several alternative explanations that can account for the data better than reincarnation. One naturalistic alternative explanation is morphic resonance, which is a naturalistic process where self-organizing systems inherit a memory from previous similar systems by genetic similarity. Another naturalistic alternative explanation is akashic field and retro-recognition, where all human experience becomes part of a collective memory bank of the humankind to be read out again and again. Another naturalistic alternative explanation is memory bundles, which explains why so many memories are connected to a geographic region and connected to deceased family relatives. Another naturalistic alternative explanation is mental ocean theory, where consciousness is like an ocean and cups are sporadically taken out and eventually will lead to overlap, which explains why some memories overlap. Another naturalistic alternative explanation is mundane explanations, such as jealousy of the opposite sex. One supernaturalistic alternative explanation is demonic possession, which explains why certain children eventually forgot their memories and knew where their bodies were after death. Therefore, the central claim of Buddhism does not stand up to scrutiny and is false. Therefore, Buddhism is false. Polytheism will now be evaluated. Polytheism includes Hinduism, ancient Egyptian mythology, and ancient Greece mythology, to name a few. What is the central claim of polytheism? The central claim is that their gods have interacted with human beings. What is their evidence? Their evidence are written records about the exploits of the gods. What are the alternative explanations that can account for the data? One alternative explanation is that the written records were written in the genre of mythology, which is when something is written in the distant past without a specific time and space. Therefore, the document is not historical. Another alternative explanation is that the supernatural events in the written records are legendary developments. The written records were written down several centuries after the alleged events transpired. Therefore, the events are legendary. Another alternative explanation is that since the polytheistic gods are internal of time and space, the gods were used as replacements for natural phenomena. For example, Zeus was used to explain lightning. In light of scientific revolution by Isaac Newton, John Kepler, and Robert Boyle, among others, the explanatory power of the polytheistic gods became negligible. Therefore, the central claim of polytheism does not stand up to scrutiny and is false. Therefore, polytheism is false. Islam will now be evaluated. What is the central claim of Islam? The central claim is that Muhammad acquired the Quran from an angel, which stated that Jesus was a prophet and Jesus did not die on the cross, among other things. What is the evidence for this claim? The evidence is the written record named the Quran. What are the alternative explanations? The Quran was written in the 7th century, which are several centuries after the life of Jesus, and is a time when the eyewitnesses of Jesus were absent. Therefore, the Quran is not historically reliable when it comes to the life of Jesus. The Quran contradicts earlier non-biblical sources and the New Testament. The Roman historians Tacitus, Lucian, and Josephus, and the New Testament all claim that Jesus claimed to be God incarnate. The New Testament records that Jesus did die on the cross, which is the scholarly consensus. Therefore, the central claim of Islam does not stand up to scrutiny and is false. Therefore, Islam is false. Mormonism will now be evaluated. Mormonism is also known as LDS, which stands for Latter-day Saints. What is the central claim of Mormonism? The central claim is that Joseph Smith acquired the golden plates from an angel, which gave credence to the Book of Mormon. What is the evidence? The evidence is Joseph Smith's spiritual experience with the golden plates. What are the alternative explanations? One alternative explanation is that it is a conspiracy theory. People only make conspiracy theories if they acquire a reward for it, such as sex, power, or money. Joseph Smith did acquire money, sex, and power as a consequence of the golden plates during his lifetime. Therefore, it gives credence to the fact that the golden plates may have been a conspiracy theory. The other alleged eyewitnesses to the event did recant. They changed the story from being about physical plates to spiritual plates. The recantation is documented. Below is a quotation. According to the former Mormon Stephen Burnett's letter from 1838, he claims the following, quote, "When I came to hear that Marin Harris state in public that he never saw the plates with his natural eye, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver nor David, the last pedestal gave way, in my view, our foundations." End of quote. It is a documented recantation. Therefore, the central claim of Mormonism does not stand up to scrutiny and is false. Therefore, Mormonism is false. Christianity will now be evaluated. What is the central claim of Christianity? The central claim is that Jesus was resurrected on the 3rd day after being crucified by Pontius Pilate. This vindicated his lordship via the messianic prophecy in the Old Testament as seen in Psalm 16, verse 8 to 11, and Psalm 22. What is the evidence? The evidence are the non-biblical sources and the anthology called the New Testament. The New Testament was written in a genre of historical biography that was written the same century as the events transpired. The following are facts that are accepted by most non-religious and Jewish scholars. 1. Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate and placed in a tomb. 2. Afterwards, the tomb was empty. 3. Jesus was resurrected, is what the skeptics proclaimed. 4. The skeptical apostles endured violence for their proclamations. 5. The skeptical apostles were martyred for their proclamation. Question: what is the difference between Muslim martyrdom and the apostles' martyrdoms? The difference is that a Muslim only gets martyred for his theology, while the apostles got martyred for their eyewitness testimonies, something they saw with their own 2 eyes. This increases the veracity of the apostles' claims, especially since James, the brother of Jesus, only became a follower after the crucifixion, not before. According to the secular scholar B.D. Ehrman, quote, The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life. End of quote. According to the secular scholar Jacob Kramer, quote, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. End of quote. According to the secular scholar D.H. Van Dalen, quote, it would be extremely difficult to object to the grave story on purely historical grounds, even if we assumed that it served the purpose of checking an incipient grave cult. That would not explain how the story arose in the first place. End of quote. According to the secular scholar Michael Grant, quote, the historian cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb, because if we apply the same historical criteria that we use elsewhere, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. End of quote. According to the scholar Gary Habermas, quote, of these scholars, approximately 75% favor one or more of these arguments for the empty tomb. End of quote. According to the secular scholar Gerd Ludemann, quote, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. End of quote. There are several hypotheses that attempt to account for the facts above. Each hypothesis will now be evaluated. 1. The swoon theory. The swoon theory states that Jesus only fainted on the cross and did not actually die. The swoon theory is false because crucifixions are lethal. It is impossible to survive a crucifixion. Jesus was dead. In John 19, verse 33 to 34, after the heart of Jesus was pierced by a spear, quote, immediately blood and water flowed out. End of quote. When blood and water flow out from the heart, a person is dead. 2. The twin theory. The twin theory states that a twin was crucified in place of Jesus. It's mainly advocated by Muslims. The twin theory is false, since the crucifixion of Jesus is mentioned by Josephus, Tacitus, the Talmud, Lucian, and the New Testament, to name a few. 3. The mass hallucination hypothesis. The mass hallucination hypothesis states that the apostles acquired a mass hallucination. The mass hallucination hypothesis is false, since hallucinations are unique to individuals. Hallucinations cannot be seen in a large group. The psychological data simply does not support that. In addition, it is not possible to touch a hallucination. Additionally, if it was a mass hallucination, then the body should have been in the tomb. Since the tomb was empty, the mass hallucination hypothesis is unable to account for this fact. 4. The theft hypothesis. The theft hypothesis states that the apostles stole the body. The theft hypothesis is false, since the apostles do not have a motive for stealing the body. They had already denied Jesus when he was alive. After the crucifixion, the apostles thought that Jesus was an impostor. 5. The legendary hypothesis. The legendary hypothesis states that the resurrection is a legendary development and a later construction. The legendary hypothesis is false, since the New Testament was written in the 1st century, which is the same century as the events transpired. Something is only legendary if it gets written more than 1 century after the event transpired. Therefore, the resurrection is not legendary. 6. Conspiracy theory hypothesis. The conspiracy theory hypothesis states that the apostles made up the resurrection. The conspiracy theory hypothesis is false, since the apostles did not acquire compensation for spreading the message. They acquired the opposite namely persecution and death from the Jews and Romans. For example, the Apostle Paul had power when he was a Jew, and then lost power when he became a Christian. Therefore, the Apostle Paul does not have an ulterior motive. 7. Mass grave hypothesis. The mass grave hypothesis claims that Jesus was placed in a mass grave. The mass grave hypothesis is false, since crucifixion victims were buried in tombs in Judea. We have archaeological evidence of crucifixion victims being buried in tombs in Judea. 8. The resurrection hypothesis. The resurrection states that Jesus was resurrected for real. The resurrection hypothesis is true, since it is the only hypothesis that adequately explains all of the facts above. Since Jesus really did rise from the dead, we can trust what Jesus said, including what he said about the authority of the Bible. In light of the historical evidence, the Jewish scholar Pincus Lapide stated that, quote, "If the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself." End of quote. Lapide stated that the only explanation is that the resurrection happened for real. Quote, "I accept the resurrection of Easter Sunday as a historical event." End of quote. According to the former atheist philosopher Anthony Flew, quote, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity." End of quote. Since the central claim of Christianity stands up to scrutiny, Christianity has the highest epistemic probability and should therefore be selected. Christianity is true.